Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And alright, this isn't a genre-specific album per se in this series, but it might actually be kind of close. There was enough on my schedule that might fit the categorization of heavy music, so going off of that, alright, let's get on the pulse. So we got 6 projects on the docket. Let's first go back and talk about, from Aran, Pimeyttä Vasten. Alright, we're gonna start off with some Finnish atmospheric black metal from a band that dropped this last month. It's their sophomore album. I'm fairly certain I mangled the pronunciation. After a pretty solid debut last year that drew in some haunted dungeon synth elements, and... Alright folks, this is one of those projects where I actually think it could have been pretty damn good, easily could have been great, but it instead winds up as a case study of the sort of production misstep that just kills my interest. See, it starts off as some pretty solid, pretty raw black metal with some potent riffs and some really solid melodic sound design in the dungeon synths, the ambient passages, and even some of the field recordings by the end. The production's otherwise pretty damn solid. And while the lyrics aren't all that special, a depressing passage into all sorts of frigid eternities that leans very heavily on imagery of drowning or freezing to death in the shadows. You know, in this sort of black metal, I'm mostly on board. I get what it is. Until we get to the grooves and the percussion. Yeah, the bass lines are not as driving as they could be, but the blast beats, they were cacophonous, they were explosive, everything they needed to be, until you realize that outside of certain blast beat passages, the kick drum is mixed right at the very front of the mix, sticking out like a flat, sore thumb. And it's legit shocking how distracting that can be, given how it's often at a much slower cadence, more often than not, than all the shredding, and it just doesn't fit in with the rest of the drum kit, which otherwise sounds fine. And what's bizarre is that in the blast beats, the kick drum sounds fine. It's only in the transitions that it sounds stunningly out of place. Just that flat clipped hit right at the very front that kills the atmosphere from what could have been some genuinely killer black metal, and really had me longing for all the ambient and dungeon synth passages that didn't have any percussion. Again, this should be a great album. The riffs, the tunes, they're mostly there. I like a lot of this, but it's that detail that's so prominent and so annoying that it holds back the entire experience on every single extended track. There's only 4 here, and it's a problem on all of them. Ergo, extremely light 7 out of 10, mostly on the fact that I know a lot of people will not care about my little nitpicks, and the rest of the album is really damn solid. Just that one thing I couldn't escape. Otherwise, give it a chance. Check it out. Next up from Trophy Scars, Astral Pariah. I'm not sure where to start with this one. Basically, Trophy Scars started off as a pretty bog-standard, sloppily produced post-hardcore act with a penchant for overwritten concepts and throwing whatever genre bending that could stick at the wall. And I'll admit right now, it was not my thing at all, especially in the 2000s, not helped by the really wonky pacing on those early albums. And then they actually found a sound around the end of the decade, basically a mishmash of post-hardcore with western blues rock, taking a few too many cues from Tom Waits along the way. Now, my general view on stylistic mashups like this is that they really have to have good production or solid compositional instincts, or they can sound really corny. And yet by 2014's Holy Vacants, I'm sorry, I listened to way too much southern rock and indie country, or even the country metal fusions to take this all that seriously, especially with the clunky writing and the vocals, both male and female. It felt theatrical and over-stylized in a way that just did not work for me. But hey, this is their first album in 7 years. It's getting some acclaim, and for once the project's running at a brisk pace for just under a half hour, and somehow after listening to it, I'm left thinking this was a comeback we really didn't need. First off, if you were hoping for some of that post-hardcore experimentation or textures from the early years, yeah, they're long gone. In favor of this country-fried, shambling blues rock thing where the guitars are trying to have some swagger even as they flood the mix with acoustic layers, the occasional splash of pedal steel and fiddle and organ and trumpet, and then the saloon piano and the clean strings passages, and even the chimes come in, where not only is any sense of atmosphere completely out the window, it feels utterly lacking in the real swagger and texture it's desperately trying to appropriate. And man, it's really trying to get that tough guy bluesy snarl going, from the chain gang jingle to the female backing vocals trying to add soul that this album can't come close to achieving, because again, having a consistently tight driving bass groove is somehow the one thing they wound up missing. It leads to a project that sounds like it really wants to create a specific texture, but has no real idea to grasp the roots and subtleties of how that sound actually works, which is why the mix feels so overstuffed and yet way cleaner than it should, with no coherent dynamics. Compare this to that Shiksa album from earlier this year that actually feels organically rooted in the cumbia and progressive metal roots. And Trophy Scars, they wound up sounding like a bad theater production again, where the frontman sounds like somebody who is actively ripping off Tom Waits while passing a kidney stone. Then there's the structural issues. If this album actually had another 15 minutes to just decompress itself a little bit, build some atmosphere, it wouldn't feel so clumsily paced and weirdly abortive, especially with all the cinematic scope that it tries to have in the story of a lone gunman killing his entire evil family, an homage to spaghetti westerns that likes the violence but grasped none of the subtleties of the stillness and atmosphere that made those films so striking. Instead replaced with this wonky vampire subplot, and it's also going for some quasi-cosmic, morally ambiguous framing, but the clunky, profanity-ridden writing, it's trying way too hard to shock the audience, especially with the sister being a prostitute, because of course she is. And honestly, it just feels like a really warped power fantasy where the tragic elements and all the daddy issues spin around and it becomes ridiculously melodramatic, even for a western. Again, sounds just like really bad theater, wallowing in cliches that can't escape how the foundational understanding of the sound and the genre is so juvenile, so undercooked, so wildly off the mark. But at the same time, I get why, to its target audience and the cult fans who will probably never hear a Cody Jinks album in their lives, it's gonna sound interesting. It's gonna sound very different. To a lot of metal fans, I get why they might think this sounds cool. The problem is that for those of us who have heard this sound done better, any of the amateurish charm evaporates extremely quickly, and I gotta think the band should know better if they're going into this territory. It's not like this is new, so solid 3 out of 10. I mean, if the fans like the comeback, good for them. I can't recommend it. Next up from Spiritbox, Eternal Blue. So I've seen a lot of hype for this Canadian act, praised as one of the accessible breakthroughs in alternative metalcore from a few ex-members of I Wrestle the Bear once, especially their frontwoman, Courtney LaPlante, after I saw their 2017 EP get a ton of praise from people that I otherwise respect. I did want to give this a fair shot, even if the djent passages gave me some pause, as again, not really sounding metal that I like. And okay, honestly, it's not that often these days where I find material that I just don't feel like I'm qualified to fully review it. But with Spiritbox, I really do feel like I'm on the outside looking in, and at least some of that is because I've just never been into this sort of metalcore sound. I'll say it again. The best way I can describe it, and take all this with mountains of salt, is that it's a weird intersection between 2000s alternative metal. I kept getting a Lacuna Coil and Deftones vibe in a few of the melodies that we do get that I couldn't shake, especially the new metal flourishes. And then you get a lot of heavy doses of metalcore, and even some hints at down-tuned deathcore, all interspersed with some radio-ready pop sounds, not counting the jagged electronic passages that feel ripped off of Code Orange wholesale. It just feels like the sort of project that's doing a lot of things reasonably well, but not much exceptionally well. The album is actually pretty well produced, but you can also tell it's a little overcompressed to make it sound more radio ready. The riffs are chunky, they got some impact, but they're not totally gonna crush you, which feels a little bit like a misstep when the album is seriously short on melodic hooks outside of the main vocal lines. And combined with the dreary atmospherics, it just makes the project feel a lot longer than it really is. I don't know, it feels like because the mainstream metalcore scene is so so goddamn stale. Anything with a sign of life and creativity and vigor is getting some hype these days, but that might be more of an indictment of the scene than something to actually elevate this. And again, as someone who's not really all that fond of metalcore as it is, outside of a couple scattered hooks among the album and cuts like The Summit, We Live in a Strange World, and Circle With Me, and those are likely leaning more on the pop side, I'm just not really all that wowed. But okay, what about the writing? Courtney LaPlante in both clean and dirty vocals, she's probably the biggest reason to check out this album, so does the lyrics deliver? Oh, I don't think they outright embarrass themselves. A lot of toxic, imploding relationships and some painful, depressive angst, which they're really trying to leverage to find something better, actually claw out of that eternal blue, that miasma, without compromising who they are. And I actually think that Constance is an effective melancholic closer in the failure to say goodbyes to those people you might lose along the way. Honestly, I do think the album actually ends quite well. But as a whole, well, I guess I hear the hype, and there's enough consistent competency to make this decent enough. I'm not really won over by it, and I'm still left with the feeling it's just not quite for me. So with all that, 6 out of 10. I imagine a lot of the metalcore, alt-metal crowd will like this way more. But you know, while we're pissing people off in analogous hype territory, from Sleep Token, this place will become your tomb.
Between black and white, not quite either day or night, she's perfectly misaligned.
I feel like I've heard way more discourse around this act than their music directly, which can be the sign of organic groundswell or a really good gimmick that this anonymous collective and their major label knows how to market really well. Because I went back to hear that debut album, known for trying to strike the balance between all the grinding, djent, alt-metal heaviness and some gleaming pop elements, all surrounding a conceptual framework of being worshippers of some deity called Sleep and their frontman's called Vessel, and I'm not really that wowed. It's not like the sort of theatrical anonymity is all that new. Forget Ghost here, this is actually quite common in the extreme metal underground. But the writing and the vocal delivery feels like a half step removed from Christian rock with an actual production budget. And let's not act like modern pop metal fusions are all that new here. Hell, strip out the artificial mystery and there's a lot of parallels to late 2010s hard rock and metal acts that were aping Imagine Dragons. It just doesn't feel that unique or potent to me. And now going into this new album, which is apparently so polarizing because it dove straight into more mainstream pop textures, and by that I mean a spread of a lot of clunky trap tones from the past 5 years, some shuddering bass and some atmospherics that are cribbed from mid-2010s indie R&B, some weirdly chirpy Jack Garrett-esque keyboards, and a vocoder track and Fall For Me that felt like somebody heard Ed Sheeran or Francis and the Lights at the end of 2020. Why am I still not all that impressed by any of this? What's odd is, again, I'm not against these pop metal fusions. Hell, add some actual tune to the lead and riffs and maybe they'd actually stick for me. That's what Devin Townsend gets right. But the pop textures go straight for these moody dirges to accentuate the frontman's increasingly oversold delivery. And once you recognize just how much he kind of sounds like Dan Smith from Bastille, all the ponderous, colorless, overlong clunkiness starts making at least a little bit of sense in the least interesting way possible. And with no real hooks here better than Bastille's best, not promising? Now, what actually surprises me that folks, specifically metalheads, are so shocked and so scandalized by all the genre bending, when you can argue that overall the riffs we get are more crushing and weighty than their debut. There's just more going on outside of that, most of which in pop we have heard before. But okay, maybe it's all building to more, courtesy of all the writing. Given how much this act wants to frame this high-concept, pseudo-religious cosmic backdrop, maybe there's more to this. The lore builds to something? Well, that's the thing. This band has the star set problem of poetry that's otherwise pretty plain and lacking that greater detail, but it's supposed to imply so much more. Some might circle around being subsumed by some sort of cosmic deity that pulls our depressed narrator into the depths, but could otherwise fall into a lot of increasingly basic, conflicted, angsty relationship songs and a lot of metaphors around depression. I think my big frustration with Sleep Token is that for as many ideas are here with overall pretty solid production, they feel really underserved by misshapen compositions and in general feel underexplored, not willing to get too weird or too challenging. So without the live experience of the lore, it just feels really thin to me. Maybe they're more of a gateway band for pop fans who want a bridge to something heavier, kind of backwards of how they're being promoted and marketed, but whatever. But as someone who has actually heard more interesting stuff both in pop and metal, or really just Poets of the Fall reiterating a surprisingly similar sound for the past 20 years, and let's not even get into Devin Townsend, yeah, this don't impress me much. 5 out of 10. The cult fanbase, y'all can have this. Next up from Pop 1280, Museum on the Horizon. Now, this was a project I really wanted to talk about. I've actually got some history with Pop 1280 as one of the first acts I covered on my channel back in 2013. So while I was thoroughly out of my depth in discussing their grisly fusion of industrial and noise rock, I actually thought they were pretty good there, and I really thought they delivered in 2016 with a wilder and manic project on Paradise. But part of that album's broad appeal was going for slightly more accessible retro grooves, trying to hit a warped balance in between their sounds and styles, where going back through their catalog now, there's a lot more tension than you would otherwise realize. Now, I will admit I kind of lost track of them in 2019, mostly because, while a little bit more refined, the atmosphere never quite coalesced to work for me and drive the grooves and the textured visceral punch of their better work, especially as their frontman Chris Bugg really reminds me way too much of early Nick Cave with his vocals. For better and for worse, it gets a little distracting. But you know what? I was excited to give this another chance, especially as I've grown a lot more fond of industrial music as of late. I've just learned and found a lot more stuff I like. And okay, I feel like I have to describe the journey I took with this album, because on my first couple listens, I was convinced this was great. It felt more immediate, the grooves and hooks felt more lean and effective, like Paradise. The vocals were more gnarled and sneering, and that worked for the apocalyptic vibes that Pop 1280 have always had. But after multiple listens, I kept getting the feeling that something was missing, something had changed, and going back to their previous catalog, I actually figured it out. Pop 1280, while still maintaining the mainstays of their artistic approach and formula, they effectively shifted genres from industrial noise rock to something close to electronic body music, EBM for short. The synth grooves are more pronounced, the drums felt a little bit more programmed, which is a little unfortunate as the wild percussion was always one of Pop 1280's underrated strengths, and within post-punk adjacent sounds, I was reminded a lot of the arc of an act like Preoccupations. And now overall, I don't mind that arc. I'm one of the few people who actually likes Preoccupations, but it does mean that the album's a little less immediately striking. It can feel a little colder, a bit more distant. And thematically, that's actually part of the point. There's a lingering sense of detachment from the calamities around our protagonists, be it more personal or world-destroying, where a prominent recurring element and theme is clones, parts of yourself that can experience the larger world while not directly breaking your numb detachment until by the very end, you have to open yourself up to all that feeling to be free. As such, the journey feels much more personal, a tangled mirrored escape where the mirrors are success and drugs and all that emotional distance, which funnily enough actually does kind of make sense for a dance-ready album, and I think this project is, and it's a little less manic and a little less conspiratorial, which to quote the band, it feels a lot less fun when the world is overwhelmed by conspiracy. They don't need to go there anymore. But at the same time, while feeling a little more sophisticated, I feel like a certain visceral rawness and punch was surrendered along the way, so I don't quite think this hits as hard as the strongest moments on Paradise, or feels quite as potent. It's still a really damn solid project, so strong 7 out of 10. Big recommendation. God damn, this act is so damn close to greatness. At least here, almost there. I'll say that. And finally, from Full of Hell, Garden of Burning Apparitions. Well, this has been a long time coming. And given some friends of mine in the metal scene in Toronto who championed this act, it was really just a matter of time. Now, when I started getting into Grindcore back around late 2018, I knew Full of Hell was going to wind up on my radar, either for their shockingly visceral content, their fusions of Grindcore with power violence and power electronics and sludge metal, or their distinctive collaborations with acts like The Body or Merzbow. But I just really hadn't had the chance to do the full deep dive, minus catching some in passing, so doing a lot of that now, with more of a focus on their solo outputs, mostly because drone isn't really my thing, and I need more time to do the Merzbow deep dive. I'll say it, for Grindcore, I like a lot of what I hear, but it can vary dependent on the album. They've gradually gotten more tuneful and manically complex in recent years, but the project to me that felt the most potent was 2013's Rudiments of Mutilation, although hearing some of that guttural, haunted production style return on 2019's Weeping Choir, it was pretty killer too. And now on their newest album, you know, I would say it's a pivot for Full of Hell, especially coming off their last project, but it's closer to a return to fundamental ethos for the band instead of a return to roots, given how often they have shifted up their sound. And that means we got a grisly 20-minute fusion of grindcore and power electronics with a lot more emphasis on the latter than what we've heard in recent years. And it's kind of a mixed blessing. I rarely found the blasts of glitch and noise and shuddering distortion all that annoying or outright ear-destroying, outside of maybe some of the honking on Urchin Thrones. And even if I was more of a fan of the earthier, cavernous production, although less of the death growls is not my thing, I actually did really appreciate how varied this album felt in between some of the insanely complex guitar passages, and dare I even say more approachable tunings and riffs. There's actually fragments of hooks here. But it's hard to escape the feeling that the power electronics feel confined to a singular frequency band that kind of limit how organic and monstrous this album can really feel. It's more bracketed and metallic. It's issues I had with Code Orange's last album, not quite as crushing in the grooves as they could be, and some of that compression does lessen the organic impact. I'm also not quite as wild about the lyrics as I would like to be. A lot of apocalyptic framing of a ravaged satellite Earth, unprepared for the desolation that's gonna come, within and without, where every being of light is set ablaze in favor of a self-consuming fire of rapacious industry, which it's not new for Full of Hell, but it feels like it doesn't quite come together as sharply as it could. And it does kind of frustrate me a little bit, because for my first time covering Full of Hell, I really wanted to praise this all the way down. But I also think Full of Hell has showcased a little bit more refinement and focus on previous projects, and even if I actually like the noise passages like Derelict Satellites and Non-Atomism more than I thought I would, I wouldn't quite say this is their best, although it's not their worst either. So, very solid 6 out of 10. Kinda wish I liked this more, but for Full of Hell fans, you'll have fun with it, and I kinda want to see them pull this off live. I'll say that. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Folks, I know doing this for purely heavy music, it's not going to get a ton of traffic. I'd really appreciate if you shared this around or commented to boost the algorithm. I'm sure I said some controversial things, thinking about that Sleep Token review just off the top of my head, but hey, please just boost this. I'd like to see at least there be an audience for me trying this sort of genre-specific experimentation. Beyond that, though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my reviews here, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, so I maybe can do this again, or get into my Discord so you can argue with me about some of this, the link to my Patreon is right over there. Once again, please don't feel obligated. Tough times, I get it. But hey, if you want to, options available. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.